If everybody could just mute themselves, please.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Please go ahead and mute yourself. I've been trying to mute everyone, but in case you sneak by, please go ahead and mute yourself so we can have the best time together as possible.
Go back to Zoom. Go back.
Welcome to our
You're
event.
not muting, but
Yeah, I don't know.
Bottom corner. Mute
Hold on.
yourself.
go back to Zoom.
Anymore.
I don't know how to go back to Zoom.
Go to Zoom. Uh-oh, we lost it.
No,
No.
it should come back.
It's gone.
No,
Yes, it is.
no, there's, yeah.
And everyone make sure your
Oh, there you go.
microphones are on mute, please.
I don't even know how to move this.
Well, maybe she muted everybody, so don't.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Michael Levick-Collier. I work here at the University of San Diego, serving as the Assistant Vice President for Mission and Ministry. And it's really a great honor and a privilege for me to welcome you to today's event in honor of Yom HaShoah. Today's event is a part of a semester-long series on Jewish culture and anti-Semitism. The sponsors of the series are the College of Arts and Sciences, USD Hillel, the Humanities Center, and Mission and Ministry. Just a few Zoom navigation tips or etiquette tips before we get started with the program. Please do keep yourselves muted throughout the series so that we minimize background noise. Additionally, in order to prevent lagging in any videos that will be shared, we ask that you keep your video off during the initial presentations. And then during the questions and answers, you can turn your camera back on. We have several presentations tonight. First will be from Talia, who will present for about 20 minutes. And immediately following her presentation, we'll have time for questions and answers to her. And then after that period of questions and answers, we'll turn it over to Saul and Linda, who will speak for 20 minutes and then 30 minutes, a few minutes after that for questions and answers. If you have a question you'd like to ask, please enter it into the chat, and then Glenda and I will put it forward to our panelists. So again, thank you for being with us tonight. It's really a great honor to have you with us. And it's really a great honor for me now to invite my colleague, Glenda, who I may have to unmute.
Okay, I couldn't unmute myself before. Thank you. Hi, everybody. My name is Glenda Sachs-Jaffe. I'm the campus director of USD Hillel. Thank you all for being here. Partnerships across faiths is truly a reflection of USD's leadership, and it means so much that we are all learning together today about this very important topic. This is Hillel's 4th year being officially part of USD, and it has been an amazing collaboration. Hillel encourages students of all backgrounds to form deep personal connections to Jewish life, learning in Israel through exploration, leadership, and a sense of belonging. Our goal is to help students find their path to help make the world a better place. During the pandemic, we pivoted to continue providing support and care for students where they needed it most. This is achieved through meaningful religious holidays, weekly Shabbats, learning, social connections, and volunteering. Hillel is there for each person. Hillel at USD is part of Hillel of San Diego, and we've been able to connect students across all 4 of the campuses. And it's been really heartwarming to see friendships being made through Hillel. Our latest program is a huge social justice service learning opportunity that's open to students of all faiths. I'd love to see everyone here involved in Hillel, and I hope to connect with you all. My email will be in the chat. Please feel free to write to me. Now I would like to introduce the amazing Talia Schauder. Talia Schauder is a freshman at Chapman University and the creator of Talia's Tolerance Tour. She created this project independently as a result of her interest in sharing her grandfather's Holocaust survival story. This first started as a project for her 10th grade history class, in which she documented her grandfather's story in writing and created a scrapbook. After this project, she realized that there was a particular need to educate teenagers in middle and high school about the Holocaust, teen to teen. This is especially important as the number of Holocaust survivors is dwindling. Soon there won't be any survivors left to tell their own painful stories. To date, Talia has spoken to over 10,500 people, 10,500 people. And now over to Talia.
Thank you. Okay, so hi, my name is Talia Schauder. I'm 18 years old. I'm a freshman at Chapman University, and I'm majoring in education, and I have a leadership minor. I'm in a sorority. I love to take pictures and spend time with my friends and family, and I am proud to be Jewish. Over the past 3 years, I have gone largely to middle and high schools to share my grandfather's Holocaust survival story, and to date, I have spoken to over 10,000 people. I have spoken within San Diego County and even internationally. Thank you to the Hillel of USD for the opportunity for me to speak today. I'm going to be presenting to you the way I present to all of my student audiences. I understand the social pressures that you experience. Today, I just ask that you put yourself in someone else's shoes. I've had the experience of my peers joking about the Holocaust. Believe me when I say it is not funny. It is not funny to have a joke made against your culture and have to walk away crying or pretend like it doesn't hurt. Enough is enough. Let's make change together. Almost 2 years ago, April 27, 2019, in my hometown of Poway, the Chabad synagogue faced a shooting. It was a Saturday morning Shabbat service, as well as being the last day of Passover. Members of the synagogue were simply exhibiting their rights as citizens of the United States of freedom of religion when they were faced with a killer, 19 years of age, who interrupted their time of prayer and opened fire. The rabbi tried to calm the shooter down, and he himself was shot in the hand. There were 3 other victims. Looking at more recent events, we see that anti-Semitism is still occurring. On February 6, 2021, at the house of the Cal Poly San Luis Obispo Jewish fraternity, Alpha Epsilon Pi, there were Jewish slurs and swastikas vandalized on the home overnight. Myers Leonard, an NBA player for the Miami Heat, was doing a live stream on March 8, 2021, when he said an anti-Semitic statement in response to a move in the game he was playing. This phrase can be seen on the slide, and as a result, he was condemned by his team, given a fine, suspended for a week, and required to participate in a cultural diversity program. It is important to become educated so that we can overcome history and make sure that hate-motivated crimes are not repeated. I want to work with you to ensure the safety and acceptance of our peers, no matter one's race, religion, sexual orientation, or differences as a whole. As today is Yom HaShoah, it is important to never forget. Aside from just knowing this motto, what action are we taking to ensure that society as a whole never forgets? I believe that in order to make a positive change for the future, we have to speak out for what is right. This brings me to my next point. Soon there aren't going to be any Holocaust survivors left. Who is going to be able to speak out for them and their memory? Think about this. In 2016, there were an estimated 100,000 Holocaust survivors of camps, ghettos, and hiding under Nazi occupation left worldwide. But they're mostly in their 80s and 90s, meaning they do not have that long left to live. Our generation must continue educating and spreading awareness. A survey was completed in 2018, and it found that an estimated 11% of US adults and 22% of millennials said they either hadn't heard of or were not sure whether they had heard of the Holocaust. And 31% of adults and 41% of millennials believe incorrectly that 2 million Jews or fewer were killed during the Holocaust. To think that people are living their lives having no idea of what happened from 1938 to 1945 to the 6 million Jews and 5 million other minorities. Today, I want to share with you a very personal story. My grandfather, Paul Schauder, was one of the incredible survivors of the Holocaust. I have listened firsthand to his traumatic experiences living through Nazi Germany and living through the Holocaust. Today, I would like to join you to create a safer and more accepting community. The Holocaust took place from 1938 to 1945. The Holocaust was the mass killing of Jews and other minorities in Europe, such as Slavs, Russians, Spaniards, Polish people, Roma, Jehovah's Witnesses, Christians, Buddhists, Muslims, people who identified as part of the LGBTQ community, as well as those who were physically or mentally disabled, and others who did not fit the Nazi ideal. There are over 6 million Jews who were killed during the Holocaust and up to 5 million victims who were part of the other groups that I listed. Let's back up to before the war had started in Germany. My grandpa Paul was the youngest of 3 sons. His dad's name was Marcus and his mom was Fanny. His older brothers were named Jacob and Herman. Paul's family was very involved in Jewish life, and they were active participants in their local synagogue, the Rashi Synagogue. Paul began attending school at the age of 6, and he attended a Jewish private school as Jews were not permitted to attend public school. Before the war began, Jews were already being segregated from the others. They had fewer rights in comparison to the other Germans, even though they were equally capable and contributed greatly to the country. Many Jews were business owners. My grandfather's family owned a department store named Kaufhaus Schauder, where they sold furniture and other expensive goods. November 10, 1938, was a date that changed everything for the Jews in Germany and throughout Europe. This date will never be forgotten by any Jew that survived the Holocaust. This was when Kristallnacht occurred. Kristallnacht, meaning crystal night, and known as Night of Broken Glass, refers to the smashing and destructions of Jewish homes, businesses, synagogues, and cemeteries by Nazi soldiers and supporters of Hitler. Kristallnacht was the turning point for anti-Semitism to rapidly worsen across Europe. Anti-Semitism is the hatred of Jews just for the fact that they are Jewish. Hitler and his Nazi officials were masters at brainwashing the youth of Germany into believing the Nazi ideals, which were driven by hate. For my grandpa Paul's family specifically, their department store was destroyed during Kristallnacht, leaving them no choice but to flee or face being arrested. The night that Kristallnacht occurred, Paul's father Marcus was arrested by the Gestapo, the Nazi police. My grandpa remembered this day vividly. He was the youngest and least suspicious of his family, so his mother sent him with bread to bring to his father in the jail cell. He was mocked and laughed at by the Gestapo. Finally, after much humiliation, Paul was allowed to see him. Paul spent his time in the jail cell crying and being comforted by his dad. Paul was unaware that this was going to be the last time he would ever see his father. The image of his helpless father, sitting alone, on a stool, in a stark prison cell, would be forever ingrained in Paul's memory. Through this experience, Paul was forced to become a man at just 7 years old. Later, Paul and his family would learn of his father, Marcus's death in the concentration camp of Buchenwald. A concentration camp is where Jews, along with the other minority groups, were sent to die. Most of the people would meet their death there. They were starved and worked to death, sent on death marches, tortured, experimented on, and killed in gas chambers. The living quarters, as you can see, were insane. Many people shared one wooden frame of a bed, and they were sparsely clothed. At some concentration camps, people were assigned a number that was tattooed onto their arm. This is how people were known, more like an animal than an actual human. Upon entering the concentration camps, the Nazis took the belongings of each person, shaved their heads, among other things. Each set of belongings, such as these rings, shoes, and suitcases, representing a person's life unlived. Outside of the camps, throughout towns in Europe, all Jews were required to wear a yellow Jewish star at all times. They had to sew it into their clothes, and if caught without it, they could be arrested or sent to a concentration camp. For the next 3 months, my grandfather Paul remained in the city of Worms, Germany, with his mother and 2 brothers. His mother arranged to rent a small apartment next to a cemetery. After 3 months, his family received notice that they would have to leave the city because as Jews, they did not have the proper permits to live in Worms. After leaving Worms, my grandpa's mother Fanny arranged for he and his brothers to stay in a Jewish orphanage in Frankfurt while she was forced to go to Berlin to work in a clinic. Inside the orphanage, the boys were able to practice Judaism and celebrate the important holidays along with weekly Shabbat. Even though inside the orphanage the children were able to practice Judaism, they were still well aware of the danger lurking outside. They remained in this orphanage for about 3 years until their mother arranged for them to be moved to a different Jewish orphanage in Berlin. Their mother was able to visit a few times, and every time she made sure to remind her sons that if they were ever faced with a threat, they had to run. This picture was taken during one of her visits and is the last picture ever taken with all 3 sons alive. Late in August of 1943, danger arrived. The Gestapo, Nazi police, had completely surrounded the orphanage, ready to transport all the children to different concentration camps where most would meet their death. Paul and his brothers came together in order to decide their plan. Both Paul and his eldest brother Jacob knew they had no choice except to run. However, Herman, a rule follower, insisted on following German law, forcing Paul and Jacob to leave him behind. Herman would later die in the concentration camp of Auschwitz. This chilling photo is of a Nazi document sealing young Herman's fate. Paul and Jacob were able to escape the orphanage through the back staircase, and through all the chaos, they went unnoticed. They ran through the dark for 30 minutes to find their mother at the clinic. Somehow they were able to find the building, even though they had never been there before. That night marked the beginning of Paul's underground life and was the beginning of an even greater set of challenges and evils. Many Jews took to a very dangerous underground life throughout Europe. The Nazis were moving throughout the continent toward their goal of killing all the Jews and taking over the world. Throughout the rest of the war, Paul, Jacob, and Fanny lived their underground life. They illegally removed their yellow Jewish stars that they had been required to wear and pretended to be non-Jewish Germans who had been displaced due to the frequent bombings. The family did not stay together throughout the rest of the war, but hid in various locations, such as train stations like this one. One event that left an impact on my grandpa was during his hiding in an apartment in Berlin with other Jews. He was the only member of his family in the building at the time, and the Gestapo had arrived to round everyone up. Thinking fast, Paul went into the bathroom and noticed a metal tub high on a ledge. He quickly climbed up to the tub and hid underneath it. Paul remained hidden until he was sure that the building was vacant. He then proceeded to climb down and found the door sealed, as the Gestapo did after leaving a building empty. If it had not been for his quick thinking, Paul would have been arrested along with the rest of the Jews. For the rest of the war, my grandpa hid with another Jewish family, the Lobel family. First, they hid in an apartment in Karlsruhe owned by a non-Jewish family. With time, the Lobels became suspicious of that family's actions, and they were fearful that they'd be turned over to the Gestapo. So they moved into another apartment owned by Otto Herner and his family. My grandpa Paul described Otto as a non-Jewish angel. Otto Herner owned an acre of land with a small barn located on the property. Due to the land's remote location, Paul and the Lobel family next moved to this barn, where they would remain hidden until they were liberated by the American soldiers. Paul's brother Jacob and mother were hiding separately in another town. When his mother had learned that Paul had moved, she arranged for Jacob to join him. The conditions were terrible. Paul, Jacob, and the other Jews lived with freezing temperatures in an uninsulated barn that they shared with a variety of rodents. By this time, my grandfather was 13. Since he was the smallest and least suspicious, he had to fetch the food, a dangerous task. This picture was taken after the war in Germany and is of the barn that Paul, along with the other Jews, lived in. After 7 long years living with the fear and unknown of whether there would be a tomorrow, my grandpa Paul and his family were liberated and reunited. His mother was hiding in a U.S.-occupied zone and was liberated first. She then went with a rabbi and 2 other Jewish soldiers on a jeep in search of her sons. In time, Fanny and her search party finally came across Paul and Jacob in the barn in Edlingen. The 3 remaining members of the family were reunited at last, yet so much of who they were had been destroyed. This is Rabbi Hazelkorn, the U.S. chaplain who took the 2 other Jewish soldiers to find Paul and Jacob. This is a picture taken after the family was together and now free. Even though they were technically free, my grandfather's family, along with the other surviving Jews, were left in a country that was uncomfortable and not home. In this picture, you can also see a dog. My grandpa was given this dog, whom he named Seppel, in order to give him something to care for and learn how to love again. He was given this dog by Captain Albert Hutler, a Jewish American Army captain who would play a huge role in getting the family back on their feet. Together, the rabbi and Captain Hutler rented a small apartment for Paul's family where they began their new, free life. Captain Hutler became a father figure to Paul. Paul, now age 14, was once again living with the remainder of his family, only his mother and brother. Captain Hutler found my grandpa Paul a job working for the American Red Cross in Germany. For his job, Paul filled 30-gallon barrels with scalding hot coffee that he brewed. Looking back, he realized that this task was actually very dangerous. The next step for my grandpa and his family was to leave Germany and begin their new American life. Captain Hutler helped with arranging the proper paperwork and money that would be required for Paul and his family to make it to the United States. By September 1946, everything had been arranged for the family's journey. That month, a military ship, the Marine Marlin, left Germany with Paul and his family aboard. It was a 10-day journey, and Paul was seasick the entire time. Hammocks served as beds for those aboard the ship. In time, the ship passed the Statue of Liberty, which for Paul represented freedom and pride. He and his family came to the port of Ellis Island. After 8 years of no schooling in Germany, Paul was able to begin his education in his new temporary home of Chicago. Schooling was not easy as he did not speak English and found himself very far behind academically. Later, Paul moved to San Diego with Captain Hutler and his family. A year later, Paul's mother and brother also moved to San Diego, and the Schauder family was reunited. My grandpa attended and graduated from San Diego High School in 1956. He continued his education at San Diego State University, where he earned a degree in accounting in 1960. During Paul's college years, he worked for a Jewish bakery at night in downtown San Diego to earn money for his family. Paul then worked with his mother, Fanny, to start an egg ranch, and together they sold eggs. Paul would later work this ranch with his wife and children for many years. Even later, Paul opened a liquor store with his family. Paul proposed to Joan, who was his wife of 56 years, in the home of Max and Rose Schindler, who were also Holocaust survivors of Auschwitz. In 1962, Paul and Joan were married in San Diego. One of the rabbis who married them was Rabbi Hasselkorn, the very man who helped to reunite Paul and Jacob with their mother Fanny years before in Germany. Paul's best man was Captain Albert Hutler, who continues to be an important figure in Paul's life. Paul and Joan had 3 children together: Margot, Mark, my father, named for Paul's father, Marcus, and Yael. They became proud grandparents as well. Sadly, my grandfather passed away about 2 years ago on January 19, 2019, at the age of 87 after a brave battle with cancer. To sum up, this strong, humble man that I've shared about today was my grandpa, and his story has helped shape the person that I am today. If there's anything I hope I accomplish, it would be for each and every one of you to be more aware and embrace each other's differences. Don't just sit in the back and let someone tell you something that you don't believe is right. Stick up for each other and the right thing. I want to share a well-known quote or poem by Martin Niamler, a pastor who spoke out against the Nazis during the Holocaust. I find this to be very powerful and still relevant today. It reads, "First they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out, because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out, because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out, because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me." Thank you all. Now I'm going to move into the question and answer. So I think we discussed putting the questions in the chat. Is that what was discussed? Okay, so if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. Or there's also the feature to raise your hand. That could be an option too. If you go to the reactions button, there's a raise hand right when you click on it. If you have a question, you can ask it that way as well. Okay, we have a question. How long did your grandfather hide in the barn? I think he was there for a couple of years because he was in the orphanage for probably 3.5 or so. Any other questions? Thank you so much.
Okay, if anybody has questions, you can also ask at the end. And yeah, so Talia, as always, you are just amazing and awesome. And thank you so much for keeping your grandfather's legacy alive and for informing us about these stories. It is just so crucial and important. And wow, you were great. Thank you. So now I'd like to introduce Sol Pinchevsky and Linda Rosenberg. The remarkable thing about Dr. Solomon Pinchewski is that he was not only a loving son, devoted to the idea of sharing the story of his parents' experience in Europe during the Second World War, but he had the fortitude to actually sit down with them, draw them out, and record their oral histories. Fortunately for all of us, he also had the vision to commission the writing of this inspiring story. What Dr. Pinchevsky couldn't have known when he approached Linda Rosenberg to write his parents' story is that she would provide historical accuracy, depth of feeling, and page-turning storytelling. Linda Rosenberg is a master educator with more than 30 years experience teaching. She's had many of her stories and novels published. And now over to Sol and Linda, and there will be time for questions and answers to both of them and to Talia. So please feel free to write it in the chat now or later. And now over to Sol and Linda. Thank you.
Thank
Hi.
you.
Oh, go on. Do you want to start, Sol?
No, I'm ready, Linda. Let's go.
Okay, so I just wanted to say that from the first day that I met Sol and his parents, I listened to their stories, I was absolutely captivated. It was like tragedy mixed with comedy, mixed with inspiration. And I thought, the story has to be told. The story has to get out in the world. And but at the same time, I was like sort of intimidated and concerned that I wouldn't do it justice. After all, it was so important that it was told just the way it should be. But fortunately, when I'd finished writing it, I gave it to my mother-in-law, who is also a Holocaust survivor. And in fact, just like Sol's mother, she grew up in Poland and she was in Bergen-Belsen.
Linda, your video is off. Thank you.
Thank you. And she was in, I still can't see myself. I can just see you, Glenn. Is it on?
You're
Yes.
on. You're on.
Okay, good. Okay, so she was in, and she also was in, grew up in Poland and ended up in Bergen-Belsen, in the same place that Sol's mother ended up, Helen. So when I gave it to her to read, I was obviously very nervous because she's one of those feisty Holocaust survivors who say what they think and that's it. But she called me and she said, Linda, it's perfect. You told our story, no decorations, just the story. It made me cry. I couldn't put it down, and thank you. So I think to Sol, okay, we did this. If this is the response I've got and we've got, then we must have done okay. And so we set off to publish this book. But I would like today for people to hear Sol tell his stories. And I think we're going to do it kind of in chronological order. And so I'm going to ask him to start by telling us about Helen's life in Poland before the war.
Okay. I'm going to show you a picture of my mother as a little girl in Poland, about 6 years old. You can see she's very well dressed. Her dad was a kosher butcher and made a decent living. And Helen had a cute little pocketbook on her arm. And she played with both Jewish children and Polish children. She loved to go and play sports with the other children in the town of Sosnowitz where they lived. And she loved to go ice skating. Now, the only day that was applicable for her friends was on the Sabbath. And most of her family was Orthodox. And that was forbidden on the Sabbath. And the most heartfelt person in her entire life. And Linda actually titled our book, The Eternal Flame. Her grandmother was her eternal flame, and it still remains my eternal flame, because grandma could take care of everything. And grandma went to her dad and said, your daughter needs to be able to go and play with other kids on the Sabbath, and I will take the sins for her. Don't you worry about it. God will punish me if he has to, but he won't. And she bought her first pair, she called them sliding shoes. They were ice skates, and she went ice skating. So that was my mother growing up in Poland at the time.
And then, of course, life took a turn and the Germans invaded Poland, but no one expected it to turn out the way it did. And in fact, I love the story I'm going to ask Sol to tell about how one of his friends, a non-Jewish farmer, was quite sure that he would be able to protect Helen. And well, why didn't you tell them what happened with that?
Well, when the Nazis came into the town, they were trying to round up young people to put them into work camps. So they were looking for both men and women. And my mother was an only child, and her father went to his next door neighbor, who was not Jewish, and asked him if she could stay in the barn. And at first he said yes. But what happened was, as soon as the Nazis came into town with their arrogance, he was scared, and he said, Benjamin, which was my grandfather's name, please take your daughter. And my mother was very worried. So the first person she ever went to, like I mentioned, her favorite person in the whole world was her grandmother. So she ran to her grandmother's house and she hid in a closet. And sure enough, the Nazis did come, and they were looking through the building that her grandmother lived in. But her grandmother left the door open. And as soon as the Nazis came by the door, she said, come on in, come on in. I'll give you hot tea. I know it's cold outside. Gentlemen, you need some hot tea. So they figured, no way this lady's hiding anything. And they just went by. And sure enough, it saved my mother. And this was just one of the incidents that my mother attributes to her grandmother taking good care of her and making her existence continue.
So, sorry.
No, go ahead, Linda.
Okay. So despite the efforts of and the planning of Helen's father and of Baba Miriam, Helen was eventually deported to a work camp in called Zyberstoff. And you'd think this was going to be like a really sad part of the story. But in fact, this is like one of the most inspiring parts of the story, because this is where Helen fell in love. How she fell in love in the environment of a Nazi work camp is a mystery forever. But that's where she met Sol's dad. And let's tell us how that happened and about Zyberstoff.
My mom was taking care of the kitchen, and she was dispensing the food. And they just had some soup, which was watery with spinach in it. And my mother had been at the camp longer than my dad, who happened to be hiding out before and finally was captured and saved his mother's life, or he thought he did, and went to the work camp. And while he was online, my mother looked at him and she said, wow, that is a really wonderful looking young man. Oh, he's handsome. And so when he came up to get his food, he was a wise guy. He said, I'm not going to eat that slop. So my mother said to him, oh, you're coming from your mother's kitchen. I understand. Wait, you'll see. Eventually you'll eat anything I have for you. And you know what? Since you're such a nice guy, I'm going to save some for you because you're going to be hungry. And sure enough, this was the start of a romance that they had, and they tried to like see each other as often as possible without getting caught, because that could have threatened their lives. So that was a very traumatic time, but not as traumatic as it goes on.
Okay, so after this time that they spent together in Zyberstorf comes the word we all hate to hear, Auschwitz. But they did end up there together. And of course, we all know, and we had a really nice presentation just before this to give us a really, really good understanding of what was like in those environments. But they were there together, and tell us a bit about what happened in Auschwitz and afterwards and all of that.
Well, they also tried to be together in Auschwitz, and they also tried to have as much togetherness as they possibly could. And my dad was working on a railroad, and my mom wrote a letter to her mother thinking that, you know, because they were in contact with each other, she thought that he would be able to, because they, you know, were very friendly, and he said that he had connections on the outside. So he took the letter that she wrote to her mother, thinking that her mother would receive the letter, and she actually did, and then sent the letter back. And when the letter came back, it didn't come to her, it came to the Nazis, and the Nazis were furious because how did a letter get out of the camp? And in essence, she saved his life, because they came and asked her all the questions about, you know, how did this letter get out? How did your mother be able to respond to this letter from the ghetto that she's living in? And my mother thought quickly, which she was always capable of thinking quickly, and said, you know, there were some musicians and artists, and, you know, I gave it to one of them, and they went off somewhere. I don't know where they went, and they believed her. And fortunately, they didn't hang them like they did to a lot of other people that were caught spying, which was what they determined the crime was.
And I just really want to add in a part that when Sol told me about that, one time they were caught, because we don't often hear this sort of thing, they were caught by a Gestapo man who was a little bit older, and he caught them kissing somewhere. And he made some comment like, what do you think you're doing here? You think you're two young, free film stars? But he didn't punish them. He just told them to be careful. And
yeah, he was my mother said he was one of the good out of the many that weren't.
Yeah, and of course we all know Bubba Miriam sent him there to do that, of course.
Of course.
Okay, so now we get closer.
Well, I also wanted to
go ahead. Sorry.
I also wanted to include the you know, Talia had presented the numbers on people's arms. Now I'd like to show you my mother's arm.
Oh yes, and tell us about the two numbers in Auschwitz. Let's not leave that out.
Okay, you may have recalled that everyone in those photos that Talia showed you, there was one number on their arms. My mother had two numbers on her arm. When my mother was a little girl, as you saw her in the picture, she was very skinny. And when she got to Auschwitz, they put that number on her, which was a number which was determined to be for the crematorium. Luckily, which she attributes again to her grandmother, she got an additional number on her arm, which was to be someone that could take care of the soldiers' barracks. And that saved her life, because she could have been in one of those ovens.
So we just, that picture is obviously much later, and we're just going to go back a little bit, because unfortunately between Auschwitz and the
Zybersdorf.
eventual getting of them back together, Helen and with David, so that they got married, was a death march, and the worst place of all, of course, Bergen-Belsen. So, Sol, do you mind telling us something about that?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, they loved each other and they were together, but as the Soviets came into Auschwitz, the Germans had them do a death march to go further into Germany, and they were separated. They put my mom on a death march to Bergen-Belsen, and they put my dad on a death march to Buchenwald. My dad was still kind of like a strong young man, and he actually snuck away from the death march with a friend of his and hid out till the end of the war. My mother wasn't as fortunate. She wound up in Bergen-Belsen. And when she got to Bergen-Belsen, she said she thought it was just worse than Auschwitz, because in Auschwitz, the bodies were cremated, so they were eliminated. In Bergen-Belsen, the bodies were piled up one on top of the other. And this was towards the end of the war. So it was very, very difficult for her. And at the very end, right before, thank God once again, and Baba Miriam, she got hit over the head by a capo. A capo was a Jewish person who actually took the side of the Nazis and was supposed to take care of, keep the Jews in line. And this woman hit my mother over the head. She already had lice in her hair and she had a major infection. And she was very fortunate because just about then the English took over the camp of Bergen-Belsen, and an English doctor operated on her and saved her life, eliminated the infection, and but unfortunately she lost her hair. From there, she found out that her love of her life was alive in Frankfurt am Main. And someone that was in Bergen-Belsen said, you know what, I can take you to David. You have to just go on the back of my motorcycle. So she said, sure, I will. And she put on a shaitel and she hung on the shaitel on the back of the motorcycle so that it wouldn't fly off, so that she'd be able to present herself properly to David. And sure enough, they matured. I'm going to show you a photo of them getting married right after that. They're the lovebirds.
I love the part where Helen, Sol's mom, told me how her biggest problem at that point was that because she'd had that surgery on her head, they'd shaved her hair off and she was bald. And she was like, how can I go to David without hair? What is he going to think of me? And so she had this shaitel, and she said how she had to struggle to keep the shaitel on her head that didn't fly off on the motorbike. And I thought that was like interesting how quickly we sort of get back to normal of some sort, where suddenly her issue became that her hair didn't look nice for this boy who she liked. I want to jump ahead a little bit now to the part of this book that's very different. So they got married, they lived in Germany, and then they went to live in America. But they didn't end up in a Jewish neighborhood. They ended up in an Italian neighborhood where those numbers, the two numbers on her arm, instead of being a death knell, became a lifesaver. So Sol was there at the time. He was a little boy living with them at this candy store in Brooklyn somewhere, Bensonhurst, I think. And so Sol, tell about the candy store and about the numbers and all the stuff that happened over there.
Okay, at first, my parents worked in a sweatshop, and they were treated like greenhorns. And of course, my dad had to borrow money from anybody he could, and he wanted to go into a business, but he had no idea what kind of business he was going into or what he would do. But everybody told him the only business you can afford is a candy store, and you although you make pennies, you'll do okay, because all the candies were worth pennies or 2 cents. Anyway, when we lived in the back of the candy store. And, you know, they were both trying to make a life. And I was about 6 years old at the time. And I tried to converse somewhat for them in English because their English wasn't that great, but they were learning very well. And this was a neighborhood of the 5 families of the mafia. If any of you have ever seen the movie Goodfellas, the candy store was right next door to the 19th hole, which was the bar depicted in that movie, which was a true movie. And Joe Pesci wound up doing something that he shouldn't, and it cost him his life. But in any event, the people that came into the store were real gangsters, obviously. And one guy came in with a truckload of shirts that he had hijacked the truck. And he said, "Hey, Dave, we're going to sell these shirts out of the store, but don't worry. We're going to give you a couple of dollars. Everything is going to be fine." So my father didn't understand the whole idea of the mafia, and he stole the merchandise and all of that. So he's, you know, he didn't know what to say. My mother was there. And then there was this gentleman who walked in and saw what was going on. And he also saw the numbers on my mother's arm. He was wearing a suit with a top hat. And he went over to my mother and he said, he looked at the numbers on her arm and he said, "You know, I know what you've been through, and I don't want you to be in any trouble while you're here in this country. So I'm going to make sure that nothing happens to you. I'm going to protect you." So she was like in shock. "What should I do?" "You don't have to do anything. I'll take care of it." Sure enough, he did. The guy left with the shirts. People didn't bother us anymore. And we had a wonderful relationship.
That was kind of why we ended up, I did start off wanting to call the book The Eternal Flame, but in the end, I thought, and we both thought, that this whole episode in Brooklyn was so unusual and so special that we had to do this mafia protection for a Jewish family. So we ended up calling it From Bergen-Belsen to Brooklyn, and to bring attention to the fact that actually a so-called bad guy really took care of them. And there was also a Catholic family that looked after them, who lived next door. And all of that part was really a reflection of that. Yeah, lots of bad people, lots of bad things, but at the same time, lots of good people who go out of their way to do good things when they didn't have to. And so in that way, it was, as I said, it was tragic, it was sad, but it was such an inspiring story. And when Solomon's mother told me about this guy, who she called the Gaon, which I think means a rabbi or something.
It means the chief rabbi.
Okay.
He was the chief rabbi.
In fact, on the book cover, there's a picture of this mafia boss with his arm around Helen in the candy store. And when you look at them, you don't know that, but that's what it is. And so that was really remarkable. And then things went well. They moved out, they moved into the suburbs. Helen had another son, Sol has a brother. There was a bar mitzvah. And honestly, when I talked to her, unfortunately, she's passed on now, but when I talked to her and her husband, the joy in them and the energy in them and the humor in them. I mean, she was always laughing and teasing me about, because I came from Lithuania. So she said to me, "You're a Litvak. Thank you. Very nice of you to come and talk to us Galicianas," because apparently, I don't know, there was some class difference in that. And it was really, really a remarkable person, I have to say. and I'm really excited to have her story out there in the world. Sol, is there anything else? I think we have a few minutes. Is there anything else you'd like to tell about?
Despite all the laughter and everything, there were a lot of tragedies that took place even after the Holocaust. My father lost his brother and left behind my cousin Dinah and her mom Hanka.
Just tell how that happened. Tell how he died.
He had a farm in New Jersey and he had chickens, and he went out one night when there was a thunderstorm, and he wanted to make sure his chickens were okay, and unfortunately he got struck by lightning, and that was a terrible tragedy for my mother, because my father had a nervous breakdown and she had to take control of the store, not to mention all the trauma for my cousin and her mom. And anyway, but everybody lived through it, thank God. And the most compelling thing to me was at my mom's end of her life, she laid in bed with her grandmother when her grandmother was deathly ill, and her grandmother told her, Mamala, I'm not going to outlive Hitler, but you are going to outlive Hitler. And I want you to get married, have children, and I want you to light Shabbos candles, and God will always be with you, and I'll always be with you. She would always hit her heart. The Buba's here, the Buba's here. Sorg doch nicht, sorg doch nicht. When my mom died, my daughter slept with her. Just like she slept with her grandmother. I thought that was such an amazing ending.
And I think that should be the amazing ending of our presentation. So thank you for bringing that up. I know how emotional that is for you, but thank you for sharing that with us. And Glenda, thank you for inviting us to share the story, because the more people that hear and know about things like this, as Talia said, the better. And we, as someone said, the first generation is on their way out. The second generation are getting old, but the third generation, so I commend Talia for that. And thank you.
And many thanks to you, Linda, and to you, Sol. Really appreciate your sharing that incredible story. We do have a few more minutes if there are any questions that people would want to put in the chat. Here's a question.
Should we read the question? Okay.
Yeah, yes. Saul,
Okay,
what was
Linda.
it like for you to read the manuscript for the first time after Linda did such a beautiful job of taking such a big story and putting it into form? What was it like for you to read it for the first time?
It was like reliving it. Linda has a great capacitance for prolific writing, and she wrote the story exactly the way it was, and I couldn't have asked for anything better. And she also had the great fortune of being able to meet both my parents, although my mom was the dominant force. And God bless her, and thank you, Linda.
Somebody asked if you could hold up the book, and then somebody's asked Linda, how were you able to write such nimble prose amid such a vast story? What choices were you, what choices were you faced with as a writer to keep things tight and fluid? And then Sol, what was it like to, we answered that. So Linda, if you could answer those questions.
Honestly, I'm going to say that Sol made audio tapes of all his conversations with his parents, and talking to him and hearing the tapes and talking to his mother. I have to say the book kind of wrote itself. They gave me, I had such wonderful material to work with. And, I had the history as a sort of a boundary. I knew where I was starting and ending. And then I had all this wonderful emotional input from them. And it just kind of flowed for me. I mean, you know, it was scary and difficult, and some parts of obviously writing about that was at sometimes like just overwhelming.
Linda, I remember you telling me that you had a difficult time during the time that you were writing about my uncle being struck by lightning and
Yeah.
how devastating that was to you.
It was such a shock to me when I got to that part, and then the brother was going to move and come live with them in New York, and yay. And then that he got struck by lightning to survive the Holocaust, and then get struck by lightning it just seemed like, no, I really, and of course, writing about Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen was like, the things that happened. I mean, we all know this, but I don't know. It was a thing. It was hard to write, but then they kept mixing in so much good stuff that I was in, you know, I had the energy to keep going because there was all the lovely stories mixed in with the tragedy. Maybe Bubba Miriam was helping me too. I don't know.
Yeah, I've read the book
Bubba
more than
Miriam
once.
is always there.
Yeah, I've read the book more than once, and I highly recommend it. We need to close now. If anybody has a few of us can stay on, but we are going to end the official Zoom. So thank you everybody for attending. Hope to hear from you all, and thank you again.
Thank
Thank you,
everybody.
Glenda.
Thank you.